a lot of what I'm going to say and do is not easy because you're going to have to think as you go through it, but I want to start right off with making sure that you don't fall into what I call the Mason trap of dating things in Greenville. And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of people assume that since Greenville was created as a separate town in 1872, that nothing existed prior to that time. And it's important that as you start out dealing with age of houses and age of things in Greenville, to recognize and remember that we were settled as part of Mason, and so our history goes right back for permanent settlement in this area to the 1750s and comes forward. And so houses follow that in terms of the development of time for them. And we have our share of old houses. And actually, we have more than our share of old houses that still exist. Unfortunately, there are a number that have burned over time, and I won't deal with those tonight. That would take a program in and of itself. I think when you look at housing and the different styles in Greenville, you've got everything. If there's been a type of housing, it probably exists in Greenville, from Cape, Colonial, Federal, Carpenter, Gothic, Modern, you name it, there's something there. But tonight, what I wanted to do was go right into the old houses, and I want to work your way through what I use as sources of information for old houses. And one of the best ways to do that is with maps. And I'm going to hand out maps for you, and there are going to be two sets that you will get tonight. What I am handing out is the great Hillsborough County map of 1850. If you go over next door into the town clerk's office, the Historical Society has one on the wall. It is one of the best resources that you can get in terms of location and accuracy of houses, which gives you a good starting point. Is my house prior to 1850, in which case it's going to show on the map, or did it come after 1850? And the first one is just a copy of the insert. I once made the mistake of loaning something out and not getting it back. It was the insert of the Greenville portion, but I was able to get it. And so if you take the first of the handouts, you'll see that it's of Mason, and it's of the section of Mason to the west of the railroad. And it's prior to the division of the town into Mason and Greenville. And so it's you have to imagine where the town line is going to be on the east and the south. But it also shows Mason Village on this. And if you do the title work on any of these, you're going to find that in the long run, this is extremely accurate. I have yet to find an error on it as you go forward. There's abbreviations that you have to be careful about. SH is schoolhouse, and there are district schools that pop in and about. You can see one if you look at Mason Village off to the right. You'll see C.B. Woolard and then SH, schoolhouse. And then you'll find SM, which is sawmill. If you move above the M on Mason Village, you'll see brickyard and Chamberlain and SM next to the river where there was a sawmill. Those are common abbreviations on this as you go forward. For those of you who live right in the village of Greenville, you're going to like the insert, the Mason Village insert, which is today. And that's always a tough one for those of us when you deal with history, because there now becomes a school of thought that assumes that Mason Center is Mason Village, and it's not. And this is Mason Village here in Greenville. And so don't make that jump that just because it's a small village over there, that's the center. And prior to 1872, this was Mason Village with a larger population and the business and industry and so forth. And again, this shows the status of the village. And so if you look at it, if your house is on this, then it was probably there in 1850 when this comes out. And so I use that as a baseline for tracking a lot of houses. In 1892, another series of maps was done, and I didn't bother to photocopy it for you, but you might picked out old maps of rural Hillsborough County. It's not as accurate. It shows roads that don't exist and so forth. But it gives you names again, and so it's helpful to track property and to date it again. It's hard for me to say, you know, as I get older, I feel old as dirt. There are times when I go, what is an old house? You know, is it pre-1900? Is it pre-1850? Is it pre-1800? What do we use as the deadline on that? And that's a judgment call for you as we go forward. The next source that I use is The Mason History by John Hill. And that was published in 1858. It's a good thing to use, but you have to work it out to get what you need for information, because it's prior to the division of the town of Mason into Mason and Greenville. And so the history is merged, and it's going to take a lot of work as you go forward. What is good about it is that it has at the back a biographical section, and there are lithographs. And I've got 2 copies of the history. I'm going to do it by row so that you can look at them, kind of. If you want to take that, Teresa, and someone can have my copy in the second row, and you can kind of show some of the lithographs, and I will give you by page number what I want you to look at as you go forward. But there are, he does a biographical sketch of leading citizens of the town of Mason in 1858. The movers and the doers, if you will, or at least the perceived movers and doers at that time. And there are 14 lithographs in the Mason town history. Of that 14, 12 of them are from Greenville. And so you have lithographs of old houses in Greenville, and I'll go through all of them. You start right at page 268 in that, and you're going to have Chamberlain, and it moves forward. I'll spend some time going through that. The other part of it that's an interesting thing is in that book, there's a list of early settlers, and it's coded, and you have to work at it. It starts at page 212, but sometimes in that list, it will tell you when people came to the area and possibly if they built, and you can catch it. The next thing that you do old houses sometimes is you read adjoining town histories. And the first of the Temple town histories, the one by Blood, in the biographical section, the genealogical section at the back is going on, and some of us read that stuff. You find the biography of a Sumner Howard, and it says in it that he grew up in Temple, left, moved to Mason Village, and built many of the early houses there. All of a sudden, you now have a person who built houses in what is now Greenville. But you also can tell in that history, it says it's a certain year, he moved out to the Midwest. So everything had to be built before he left. And you have a little clue of who built. You can take it one step further, and I did that. You can go to the Registry of Deeds, and you run his name, and you find that he bought property, built houses, sold it, and bought adjoining property, and built a number of places on Main Street or East Main Street, and you can see some of that progression, and you can assume within a certain time frame must be when some of those houses were built. So it's sort of a detective story as you're trying to find the age of houses, and it's difficult to say, well, this is the exact year, but you can certainly get within parameters of time for that. The other part that's really interesting is that here in Greenville, we're fortunate in that Archie Eaton, while he was alive, went and sat down with Henry Gainey. And for many of you, Archie was the town clerk and a historian of note. He liked dealing with Greenville history. He took a real strong interest in it, and he tried to preserve a lot of it. He either collected pictures or documents and so forth. But he sat down with his predecessor, town clerk, Mr. Gainey, Henry Gainey, and they went up and down the streets of Greenville and made notes. And they made them on insurance company paper because they both sold insurance and so forth. And they have these wonderful notes from Henry P. Gainey, summer of 1951, history of places in Greenville. And so I started to decipher them and get them in some order so that we have it for the future in the Historical Society. I'll give you a sample of some of the notes. This is River Street. The Ely House, or Mr. Ely, dealt with the mills and so forth. And he lists Samuel Haynes, W.C. Green, F.W. Ely, and Rohr. Those are different people that owned it. It was the agent's house, the last house on the left before you cross the line into New Ipswich. It sets back and has the row of maples along in front of it. The next place as you come along, he marks as the Doonan place, which was where Will Doonan lived, who was moderator and tax collector for years and stuff. Mrs. Pierce, mother of Frank Pierce, was grandmother to Charles Livingston. Charles Livingston's father was George Livingston, cobbler. He ran away with a woman from New Ipswich and never heard from. Surprise, surprises. This is what those notes are. They're fascinating in that you get this, not only do you get stuff about houses and when they were built, but who lived in them and some of the dirt as to what goes and stuff. And so there's another one. He's dealing with George Robbins and so forth. Father was David Robbins, born in Mason, son of John Robbins. So if you're doing genealogy, that's great, and it lists, had a brother and 3 brothers, 1 sister. Willard lived in Mason, had 2 sons. Owen lived in Wilton, had 2 sons. Eunice married a Weatherby, went to California, and another brother, Tom, used to come and make baskets. And then he talks about another one who was an actress. She had a stage name. Someone else dropped dead in a barn in Mason, and he goes on and on. Then he says, David Robbins lived at the Doonan place. Buildings were burned except for the L, where Mrs. Robbins lived while David was at the Civil War. So all of a sudden you're starting to pick up not only the main part of the house burned, but the L survived. And if you go out there on Adams Hill, I guess that's still there. Later lived at the Hyde place on Temple Street, and that is midway along, and I have a hard time giving a reference point for you without a number. Where George was 3 years old, they moved to the farm where George always lived. House there was very old and poor when they went there. Jerry Boynton used to live at the Robbins place, and that's a Boynton, for the Boynton family that the school is named for, and all of the tinware. And then he puts in this, Jeffs used to live in the pasture south of Doonan's, the Whitney lot. And then the older buildings at the Doonan place burned when David Robbins lived there. But it's interesting that he talks about this A. Jeffs lived up in the Whitney lot. I remember that as a kid. That was woods, but they always talked about it. The Doonan family owned it. And if you go up this wood road and you get to the top of a hill, there's a cellar hole and a well, which is the place that they talk about. But it was never ever developed as anything other than, must have been sort of a small house that somebody tried to eke out a living and must have abandoned at some stage. But you get these wonderful notes, and that's a resource for Greenville's history of houses as you go along. The hard part is you have to decipher what Mr. Gainey is referring to for people as to where they live, and then bring it forward. And so what I've been trying to do is use house numbers, street numbers, because then you have a constant. Otherwise, when you talk about the Buttrick place, are you talking about where I live, where Charlie lives? What are you talking about? And without a number, it's hard to peg it. And so we go along. Then you can always spend like forever at the Registry of Deeds trying to find out, does the deed to the property refer to a building on it or a house? And occasionally you will come across deeds that do that. They will start at the southeast corner of the lot, which is 3 rods away from the dwelling house. Well, at that stage you know there was a house there. Whether it's today's house or not is still subject to speculation, but it gives you something to hang your hat on as you go forward. And then we have pictures that sometimes can help as we try to date houses or find the location. But what I wanted to do was find how many houses do we have that predate 1800 in Greenville, and then move ourselves forward. And I've come up with a couple of them that I think are worth doing, and then we'll go through what the Mason history shows for old houses. I come up with one on Livingston Road, about as far south of old houses that I can get, which was a house that was built around 1780. That's the Colonel James Wood place. It's now where Maureen Fry lives as you across from the intersection of Old Ashby Road and Livingston Road. Turn and go up Livingston Road, and it's on the right there. And if you look at it, you'll see it's red. It's a Cape-type house, and it's an old house. And there are pictures that go back quite a while. Another old house is up on Merriam Hill, the Micah Russell place. I knew it as a kid as the Flynn place. Again, another red cape, and it just recently, within the past 10 years, got moved further away from the road, but it faced to the south. There was a small cape and was there. Another place up on Merriam Hill that's an old house is the Frost Farm. If you drive into Frost Farm Service, the house on the right is an old house. Now, whether that predates 1800 or is a substitution house, that is, there was an earlier house there and then this one got built in its place, I can't tell you. From its style, I question whether it was the first of the Merriam houses that Joseph Merriam built. He lived there first, then he buys property on the other end of Merriam Hill at what we call another place, or some of us do. Built that brick-in house, and then built across the road for the son the Merriam Hill Center place. And so you have the three different Merriam places up on the hill and stuff, but the oldest of them was clearly at the Frost Farm. You get out onto Adams Hill on the north end, and you have the Oliver and James Scripture place, which is where I grew up, where my brother Charles lives. That was built in the 1770s, more or less. And then you go up the road, and there's the Ebenezer Adams place, Pullman's. That one, Archie dates at 1771. I'm not sure how he got the date of 1771, but it's an old house. And it's there. Across the road was an old house that was taken down in the, right around 1970, where Galewin's is where Zandy Taft built. Another very old place on Adams Hill is the John and Reverend William Elliott house, which I knew as Pillsbury's. It's where you go around by the ledge on the thing, and it's a cape, faces to the south, and has sat there for years. Where I live on the hill had an old cape, but they decided to upgrade around the year 1900, jacked it up off the foundation, expanded the foundation, put a Victorian house in its place, and trashed the old cape. And so I can't claim anything other than in the L as being old. When you get down to Russell's Corner, there was an old house there. It burned and got replaced by the Russell place that we knew. But you come along Adams Hill again, and you move a little bit further, and you get to my Aunt Mary's place, and again, owned in the Bullard family, and it's hard to tell. You can tell from the deeds that it existed by 1814, and there's a transfer from one Bullard to another, father to son, almost as though a retirement occurred. With the deed, the son got the obligation to support the parents. And the deed specifies how much wood and how much food is to be produced and delivered every year for it, and so forth. Again, it's a cape. Another place that had a very old house was on Rousseau Hill Road, at the Rousseau place. That was the Lawrence place, and it looks as though that's a replacement house of an earlier house. Now, whether in the L that moves along to the barn is old or not, I don't know, but clearly that was built in the 1750s, 1760s, this main road from Mason to Mason Village. If you come right into town on Hubbard Road, as you come up around the curves on the left where there is a Valancourt lives in a cape there, that's a Richardson place, and that is extremely old as well and predates 1800. As you come along the main street, you have any number of places that come in after 1800, but definitely on the right, beyond Newell's, the Carpenter Gothic place, you will see the Salt Box house. It's white, sets back in. That is pre-1800, and that was a Dakin place because the Dakins owned the mills, handy right by, and then they kept graduating into bigger houses. But that is an old house there, and it's probably in the 1780s. When you get along Temple Street, I have a hard time as to two of them that are probably pre-1800, but I'm not sure. And that is the Enright house that sits right on the street, the brown one, and then possibly the Reardon house that is attached somehow to yours may have some age to it. I haven't done the research to be able to peg it for sure. but it does. You move along and you head out the Temple Road, and there's the Dunster Kimball house. But that's not pre-1800. That's a house that was built in 1815, but replaced an earlier house. And so it wasn't unusual with settlement. They got a very quick Cape house built, stayed in it for a generation or two, and then decided it was time for an upgrade, up and out, and something else is built in its place. And so that moves us right into what I want to talk about in the Mason history, because you have the pictures of houses. And so if those of you who have them can sort of show the others around as we go there. Page 268 it shows Malone and Chamberlain's house. And that's, I just did, I grabbed it for you, Charlie. They took, and that house used to be where the Chamberlain Taft house is on Main Street. And it got moved. It got moved down onto Mill Street. And so you have a picture of it, but it's a moved house. Then at page 270, they show the Chamberlain Mills, and you can see not only the mills, but the Stone Arch Bridge, which is still there. You move on to page 272, and it shows the Simeon Craigan place. The Craigans married into the Barretts, and the result was the big house that sits on the bluff across, right behind the war monuments, is the Craigan place, or some of us would call it the Brooks Barrett place. It's a brick end, federal style house that reflected that they had and stuff, and went forward. At page 277, they show the George Eliot place. That's the house that's brick end between the Carpenter Gothic place on Main Street and Lazard's, okay, and built in the 1820s. Page 291 shows you another of the moved houses in Greenville, and that's Dr. Marshall's place. Where the post office block was where his house was, and then in the early 1900s, when they built that, they moved his place up onto Temple Street, and it became the Burgo House up there. They just moved it to the back of the lot, flipped it around, and then built what is now where the post office is. Then they show the Moses Merriam place, which I've talked about at 298. That's the Frost Farm place. If you look, that's a dead ringer in it. You can't miss it. If you go in, you look at the door and so forth. And Moses Merriam was a son of Joseph Merriam, lived there for all of his life. Page 298, they show Stephen Smith. Stephen Smith's house is the last house on the way to New Ipswich on the left, the agent's house. The Columbia Manufacturing Company is one of the perks for the person in charge. They got free housing, and they got the best housing. And it was always said in the Columbia Manufacturing System hierarchy, you knew your rank based on housing and stuff. If you got a single family type housing, you were doing well in the system. If you were in a duplex, you were doing okay, and if you were in multi, you were further down. And then if you were stuck in rooming houses, you were at the bottom of the lineup for the company and stuff. And so they show that house, and if you look at the picture in the town history, you can still see the lattice work is the same, and the lines are all pretty much the same. At page 304 in the Mason history, they talk about the Timothy Wheeler place. That burned. That's on Barrett Road on the south side of Marion Hill, where Robert and Judy Wilkins now live. It was a large colonial house that had quite some age to it, and it was actually two houses adjoining each other in a large barn. And that's what that one's all about. And then page 306 is the Colonel James Wood place, which is one of the oldest places in town on Livingston Road, and it shows there. Then we move to page 310, and they show two sets of Taft things. And the George Taft place is where Jim and Jean live at present, and so that's in that. For the store that they show, that was where the drugstore is now. When I say the drugstore, see, I slipped into my recollection of what it is, where Nenny's was. Okay, we'll bring it right up to the current instead. And that got moved as well. Greenville has this wonderful history of places being moved. And I want to go through some of those houses that were moved. In the 1800s, right up until the time of electricity and phones, it was easy to move a house. You didn't have to worry about the light lines. It was generally post and beam construction, so you could jack them up and move them. And some people, when they did upgrades, they moved the old house to another location, and they went all over the place. And there are 9 houses right here in the village that have moved. They didn't move themselves, but they were jacked up, moved, and off they went. The first one that I think most of us would note is what I knew as the Francis Duval place on Mill Street. It used to be right here where the town hall was. And to build the town hall in 1876, they had to move it. There was a store, and they right back through and down and plunked it on the upper end of Mill Street. And that's one of the moved houses. We have pictures of it when it was here, and you can go out and take a look at it today, and they match.
What house is it over there?
It's as you're coming up from the intersection from the number 6 bridge and Chamberlain Street, and then you have the road that goes up the hill on the right, Dunster Hill Road, or whatever it's called. Ice Street, or whatever.
Yeah, Ice.
You keep going on the left, there's a small house, and then this one is a 2-family. And then you start getting, there's the apartment thing in back, and then the white one. It's right there across from Rhea Valancourt DeRoche's. Okay?
So what color is it?
I think it's white.
Right.
Okay.
And it's got a garage to the left that's attached,
Okay.
and a bit of a porch to the right.
Oh, okay.
Okay? That's one of the moved houses. Second moved house is the house that Bruce Aho lives in on Pleasant Street, that's set back from the road.
Right.
Go up past the brick church on the left. There's that house. That house, as a kid, I knew it as where Esther Kimball lived all of her life. But that used to be where the Carpenter Gothic house is on Main Street, Newell's. And that got moved in 1850, right around that period of time, because that house was built, the Carpenter Gothic, in 1850. And so they just jacked it up and moved it up there as a federal-style house, and there it is. The next is a house that moved from Pleasant Street down the big hill on Hubbard Road, and that's, it was the Darling House is what I would call it. It went from where Stacy and Mike Delval live at present, to up from the brick church on the right. That's a new house there. That house was built in 1887 by Hammond Elliott, who came to Greenville because he was upset with his taxes in Mason. Felt that they were taxing him too much on his stock and stuff. He used to live down in Pratt and stuff, so he came up here. And one of the things that he did was he built a new house and took the old one, went down the hill. Pretty easy to do. As you go down the big hill on Hubbard Hill, you're going to go past first the Bergeron place with the garage, then what I would call one of the, it slips me now, but there's the house with the corner as you go around on the left. And then the next house that's tucked in is that house. And we have a picture of it when it existed on Pleasant Street, and then you can see where it has landed now.
Who lives there now, Marshall?
I don't know now. What's that? Then the next one that's a moved house is on Adams Hill at the very foot of it, right near the blinker. And that is where Bob Butcher lives. If you head up Adams Hill at the blinker, the second place on the left, you have to go in back. It's a little red house between Phil Lafrenia's and Alan Wright's. You go in this little narrow driveway across the brook, and there's a red house in back there. That house wasn't a house initially, or at least it appears that it wasn't. That was the first railroad station. And it got moved when they built the new railroad station, which is now the Panda Walk. And that got moved over to that area there. Another house that got moved and played a little bit with was the house that Alice Lazat lived in on Adams Street. If you're going up to the school and the playground, just one beyond the playground on the left. Again, that wasn't a house, that was one of the old public schools that got moved from the hill to build the public school that I went to that preceded the one that's there now, okay? And that's a long haul. The village had its first public school that the laundromat is now. That was a 2-room brick school. That went from the year 1820 to 1850. Then they outgrew it and they needed more than 2 rooms. So they built the new school in 1850 on what we would call the Schoolhouse Hill over there. And that was a 3-room white building. And then around I think it was 1907, more or less, they decided time for another upgrade, and 3 rooms aren't cutting it, we'll go to 4. And they did, it was an interesting thing because at the same time, they built the Sacred Heart School, and the same contractors just built one on one side of the river, moved across, and built the other one. And they were very similar in design and in terms of the internal configuration of the buildings as well. But it was the 1850 school that then got moved over onto Adams Street, and that's where Alice Clark lives. That was changed into a house. Another house that moved was Bugsy Burgo's house. That was Dr. Marshall's, where the post office is. You could almost imagine it as you come up Mill Street, you would have looked straight at the house. And then they moved it up onto Temple Street and built the present Burke block.
Which
where the
house is
post
it on
office
Temple
is.
Street?
As you go along Temple Street on the right, you start to do the turn a little bit. It's a red house, and on the right, and there's the little alley that cuts through down to the post office just beyond that. That's the house that got moved there, okay? Then we have on Chamberlain Street, well, not Chamberlain Street, the Chamberlain House that was where Bob Taft's house was, got moved down to Mill Street, and that was moved, good question, sometime between 1858 when they built the mill down there and the 1860s when they built the Chamberlain House up here. And so I can't give you anything more than that. They changed the configuration of the house. It doesn't face to the south, it faces to the west. And as you come across the Mill Street Bridge, the number 6 bridge, and you look at that house, it's gray, I believe, at this stage.
Green now.
Green.
Yeah.
If you look at the windows, there's one set that is still original that has 2 over 3 in terms of the numbers of panes of glass, and you can tell that that's original. Also, if you look at it, it should have had 5 windows across the top, 2 on each side with a central door that isn't there instead. And I suspect that what the Chamberlains did was, they had the mill down there, and they're going to upgrade, move the house down, and put some of their employee or whatever in that house. And it went with that property for a long time, and then they separated it and so forth. But that's a house that moved. Then we have another house on Pleasant Street, Temple Street, that moved from the Dunster Place down. And I think that that may indeed be Reardon's, but I'm not sure. In the Dunster genealogy, there is mention of a house that gets moved from up near the Kimball Dunster Place, Kimball Heights, down closer to town as a new, when they built a new house. But where that landed on Temple Street, I'm not positive. And so it's on the east side of the street, clearly, but I can't tag it. And then there was the store that the Tafts initially had right at the bridge where Nenny's is. And that got moved down onto Chamberlain Street, somewhere down there. And I suspect that it was what is now owned by the Pelletiers. Right beyond the little park in the island on Mill Street, the White House that backs up against the river. And so you have those as old houses in Greenville. What is the oldest house in Greenville? Archie Eaton never would venture a guess on that, and I would likewise not do so, because I don't think you'll ever be able to say with any great certainty, this is definitely the oldest house. You can come within time frames, and there's going to be a couple that run for it. There are all sorts of houses that fall into the period between 1800 and 1850. all you have to do is look at the map of Mason Village, and you've got a good supply of old houses that are there. And one of the things that you will find in a lot of the houses is old stuff that shows that it's old. The ironwork, the doors, the latches, clearly will show that. You will find lots of interesting wainscoting in different old houses. You will find different mantles for houses as they go forward. You will find in lots of the houses upstairs bedrooms that have fireplaces, and they're small chimney openings because they need just the quick heat, and that was it, and large hearths in the basements. And so you can see that as you go forward with the development of housing in Greenville. One of the drawbacks to some of the old houses is that if you're trying to restore, you're dealing with lead paint as you move along. Be aware of that and so forth. But there are some really good architectural gems of old houses that are tucked here, there, and everywhere. And so what I did was I brought in what the Historical Society has for pictures of houses by street. And I did them alphabetically. I'm not going to haul them all out, but afterwards I think I'll just put them out on the tables and you can look at them. But what I will do now is entertain questions. Do any of you have questions about what I've gone over for sources of material for dating houses or some of the old houses, or did I talk about places that just aren't making any sense to you?
I just have, it has nothing to do with that, but what mechanism did they use to move these houses? Were they on log rollers, or were they on wagons, or?
I assume that they were probably very low, some sort of roller type.
Because you're talking about some big houses.
Yeah, some of them were two-story houses that
Yeah.
they jacked up and
Well,
moved.
they use flatbed wagons.
No idea exactly how they did it, but
Flatbed wagons.
you know, given that they were, I would assume they were all post and beam construction, so you can move them a little bit easier than the current construction and going forward. They wouldn't have had to jack them up high,
Just enough to
just
get the
enough to
bed
get
on.
them something in under to move them, and then they probably moved them with oxen.
You moved a lot of houses in this town, huh?
It's a fair number of them. The other part that's difficult, and I could spend a whole evening doing the houses that aren't here, the ones that burned. And that some of us say, it's always the wrong piece of property that burns when we have a fire. And, you know, and so we've lost some really nice places as well as you go along. So, other questions that you might have?
When was Mason divided into Greenville? 1849?
No, 1872
72?
was when the
Is that
division
accurate?
occurred, yes.
Because I seen a map of 1849 that Mr. Eaton used to own. And it said 1849 on it.
Well, the map
And it
may
was,
indeed do that, but the town was not set off as a separate political entity until 1872 by
Okay.
act of the legislature. I mean, some of the division and so forth was occurring
Because
a
it was
lot
all Mason
earlier.
at one time, so they
That's
just
right.
bang.
And so it's hard to pull it apart, because when you're doing title exams, you're going to have to start checking names
I got
under
you.
the Mason indexing and so forth. And when you're doing
Well,
Civil
that's
War
close, anyway.
stuff, it's very difficult, because where did they live and what for why as you move forward. One of the sources that is good for history in that regard is in the Hurd's History of Hillsborough County. There's a small 4-page mini history of Greenville that was written by the Reverend George Merriam, who grew up on Merriam Hill. His parents moved to Temple. He then went on to school and so forth, became a minister and came back and spent from the 1860s to 1899 as pastor of initially the Second Congregational Church in Mason, because that's what it was here in Mason Village, which upon the division of the town became the Congregational
I
Church.
got another question.
So he knew a lot, and he was able to write it and pins it quite well as to this, that, or the other thing. Okay, I'll take your question.
Did you get any kind of information besides your research and your information? Did you get any of this information from a man called Charlie Proof?
No, but I
Did
do
you know Charlie
Yes.
Oh, I did too. I used to look out for him. But I mean, he had a lot of information about this town.
there are lots of people who had information. The
Yeah.
tough part was getting them to say it and put it in writing.
Well, I never seen him say anything, but he knew a lot.
Other questions that you may have?
How would you go about, what would the steps you would be that you would take to research the history of your house?
I think one of the things that you do,
Really
you
deep.
ask all the old geezers if they know anything about it. Yours has pictures that are around. What I would do is I would do a title exam. I would go to the Registry of Deeds in Nashua
That's where you gotta go.
and start looking to see. You can start doing some of yours. You're on Dunster Hill. And so you look at the map and you can see that it hasn't fully been laid out in 1850. It's just being developed, okay? It's part of the Chamberlain property, and they start developing it in the period of the 1850s forward, and they do it in grid fashion. It's one of the first developments in Greenville, is that part of town, okay, the village. And so sometime thereafter is going to be when your house is built. Can you date it? For sure, I can't do that. And one of the things that I would tell you is next to impossible is you can't do it from tax records because most towns don't keep that information. So you can't tell, okay, all of a sudden there's a spike in what somebody's paying, they must be paying, so they must have built at that time. You have to rely on notations and a little of this and a little of that as you piece it together for aging and seeing what it is.
I may have missed, you may have said it before I came in, but how many houses in town are actually from the Chamberlain Mill or part of the Chamberlain complex? Columbia?
Not as many as the Columbian.
Okay.
The Chamberlains had some housing and sold off bits and pieces, so that all of up on the south side of Dunster Hill here, Ice Street, Dunster Hill Road, and Ash Street, is all Chamberlain property. So that got subdivided and sold. They generally didn't rent out their property as like the Columbia Manufacturing Company did. They also owned in the flats. So as you crossed over the number 6 bridge and you head down, all on the left was primarily owned by Chamberlain and then Taft. And so they started cutting off bits and pieces and allowing development down there, Baker Ave, and then White Street as being
And
areas.
then the
that-
others would be Columbian then?
That's right. On the other side of Mill Street was the Columbia Manufacturing, and so they had housing on Temple Street, your place. They had a house on East Main Street, which is now Hubbard Road, that they owned. The third place on the right, Valancourt, was owned by the company. The rest of their housing, they of course had the inn across, the boarding house, but they had Charlie Prue's apartments. As you cross over the number 6 bridge going down, up in on the right, there's 2 or 3 tenements there. And then you go to the next series, the next Acton Court, Ashton Place. All of that was mill housing at some stage, and they worked down. And then they would, at one stage, they carved off a lot of it. You find a lot of mill housing, also Columbian Avenue. All of the duplexes on Columbian Avenue were mill housing. And then they had somebody stashed up on Pleasant Street, one below the parsonage where Mr. LaFeria lived when I was growing up, which would be, there's the house that sticks, a cape that sticks right out on the road beyond Del Val's, and it's the second one beyond that was owned by the company as well. And so they had housing tucked in all over the place. They had the agent on River Street, and across from the agent's house was the DeRozier place, and it actually shows in the notes that Mr. Gainey does. And what did he mark? He did something. The DeRozier home, always used for help at the agent's house. They didn't have their help live in. They were down and across the street in that little yellow house that's tucked between the road and the river.
Right.
You know, it's one in which you open the window, you're looking out on the road, and the other window, and you're looking right out onto the river. It'd be a great place for a deck, if you ask me, wrap it right around and stuff. But that was.
That would be the
mill
one
housing.
right out here?
You know, as if you're going to New Ipswich,
Okay,
beyond the
New
fire
Ipswich,
station,
okay.
keep going on the right.
The little cape
down here,
Right, yeah.
that was a workshop for the mill, and then it was the Sportsman's Club
Really?
on stage, and then it was converted into apartments, and then converted into more apartments. And so-
No, the little tiny cape, that couldn't have been.
Oh, the Tiny Cake was a blacksmith shop.
Okay.
House.
Okay.
There was a blacksmith in there. And that, I don't know how far back that goes
Okay.
in age. That was always a blacksmith shop in there, or for a long period of time.
Would you explain the barn, 'cause it's a nice barn.
Yeah. There were any number of blacksmith shops kicking around in the village. There was one there, there was one where Rhea Valancourt DeRozier lives at the corner of Mill Street and Ash, right? The one that doesn't go up by the telephone, but the other one, where Gauvain's Garage, it was a blacksmith shop. And so you had them tucked in all over the place. If you didn't like one, I guess you went to somebody else took care of the horse.
I think Paul DeRozier said that our house, 10 Dunstray Hill Road, was a blacksmith shop at one time. He had a sign, he found a sign that said the street number and that it was a blacksmith.
I'm not sure. I think yours was always a residence, but the person who lived there may have run a blacksmith shop further down. Are you following where I'm going with that? And so it's possible that there would be a sign that there were blacksmith shops here, there, and everywhere. They needed them. Gee.
We have tried to follow the house at the registry, and you showed me how to do that, but we hit a roadblock because there was, the inheritor was a woman who was deemed incompetent, and I don't know where to go from there.
Well, those are always, you do hit those in doing title exams. Sometimes you run into the problem of inheritance and you have this gap because there's not a deed, but rather you have to go over into the probate system and the will serves as the deed, or there is no will and it's by intestate succession and distribution. And that then becomes legally difficult as you're going back because you'll see various people with different last names signing a deed. Well, that's because they inherited it from mom or dad who died without a will. And so there are those gaps that sometimes occur. And there may indeed be a probate proceeding where someone was declared incompetent and a conservatorship placed on the person. There would be basically a trustee who would have tantamount to a power of attorney to sign off for them. Then you run into the problem of how did the registry index when they did that? Did they index under the incompetent person's name, or did they index the transfer under the trustee's name? Did you follow? And so you end up with those gaps. You also, the registry is not infallible. There are people who didn't bother to record their deeds. And so you have missing pieces as well. I think the inheritance one is often the tough one. Or you get into a family that is a large family and they use the same name. And how do you deal with that? You really have to work it by the description of the property and so forth. I'll give you some examples. The name Adams, you know how we have 3 Adams Hill Road, Adams Street. Fine and dandy, but there were 2 Abel Adams. There was Abel Adams that lived where Dick and Barb do at the corner of High Street and Temple Street. And there was Abel Edwards Adams who lived at the Tolman property on Adams Hill. Both Abel. And it gets worse. They both attended the same church. And so you can't undo it that way. Another name that is a difficult name, that a Mason name, is the name Jeffs. Jefts. All over both towns and trying to unravel who belongs to whom for what, for why, is not easy. Or the name Lawrence as an early name in Greenville. It's hard to undo that. Barrett is another name that is a difficult name because the town of Mason, when it included Greenville, had 5 different Barrett families, all distantly related, but living in various parts of the town. And you have to sort that through as you go forward. You know, Brooks Barrett, well, that's the big house by the war monuments and stuff. Related, of course, to the Barretts in New Ipswich, distantly, and so forth. There's a connection. Cousins to the Dakins. Barrett builds, you know, one of them builds the first mills and then sells to his first cousin. You know, the deals keep it in the family and move it right along. That's what they would do. And so you have those names that sometimes it's like, how do I track it? And there are occasional gaps that you have. But I think it's fair to say that your house was clearly built in the early 1800s. I'd love to run it further and see what for why, but I haven't had the time.
On this map that you've given us,
Yep.
what is the name that's with our house? Because I can't read what that name is.
Well, as you look along, yours says CM something F Co.
Right.
Yours is owned by the Columbia Manufacturing Company
Okay.
at the time, okay?
Yep.
And stuff. As you go along, you can see the A. Adams, that's Abel Adams, and then up the street is N. Adams, that's Nathan Adams going up the big hill. That would be where the first of the Catholic Church rectories was, where the parking lot is now. And then that got taken down and replaced with the rectory that many of us knew as kids, and now is the CCD Center. That's where that is as you go along. If you look, you can see there's a lot of mill housing that's just marked CMANF. CO, that's Columbian Manufacturing Company. It's interesting that they put the school on the hill as the grammar school and they spell it Grannair. Looked at that and I wondered when I saw it.
It's the French version.
If that hadn't happened in 1850, that was a premonition and stuff. If you look at the insert of Mason Village, it's not a bad one because it's got the Chamberlain grist mill and so forth, and that was part of what was there was a grist mill and then furniture. It was dual purpose in that mill. And you can see that the depot and the engine house and the railroad are a little bit further away than what they currently are at that time. And this is from a map of 1850. The railroad has just made it to Greenville in 1850. They started running trains as far as the river in 1849, and it took them a year to build the bridge and get the railroad into town and stuff. And so you see that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's you notice. There are two tin shops that show in this insert of the town as it goes along. Jim, you had a question.
I was just going to add to, when we were looking back on our property, it appears as if the house that was Dr. Wellwood's belonged to the Stevens family.
That is correct.
And that there were 3 or 4 pieces of property that are all labeled Stevens, and we have had difficulty figuring out which of the Stevens property we currently own.
And it gets touchy because one of the Tafts married a Stevens. And so there's a relationship between them as well. And then your property at one stage had a right-of-way that cut around onto High Street. And I think that shows up in some deeds as it goes along and then got extinguished. That's right around Dick and Bob.
I'm way down on the
Dave.
turnpike, so we'll never find me.
Yep, you're at one of the Winship houses.
I think it's a Davis two-sider and GM for Bristol. And
No, it's S, I think it's SM for Sawmill, but
maybe, well,
no, it looks like a GM, but it should be an SM.
Look at this, I took a photo this morning. I think that's an old foundation. Yeah. That's.
They clearly had a sawmill out there as well at a period of time, David. And
Where is he?
he's on the turnpike
Oh.
in Greenville, okay? And the Davis family owned the 2 properties there, his house and Ted DeWinter's across, but the Winships also owned them before the Davises, I believe, or both names kick in as you go along. And it's a whole different world, if you will. The only thing that you can help date on yours is that it has to be after the turnpike came in. when the houses there would have been built. Prior to that, of course, that road didn't exist, and the older road was further back, the Pierce Lane thing that was no longer a town road, it's just class 5. It's a mess because it goes through 3 towns. And so, those are never, pardon me, yeah, that's the same road. It goes by different names depending upon which town you're in.
So when did Main Street come in?
Depends upon which section of Main Street.
Well, this.
From the bridge to the depot, that was pretty much in the 1830s/1840s. Okay, Temple Street is an original 1700s road. That was how you got from Mason Village to Temple, was right up Temple Street. Okay, and initially you went up Temple Street and then you cut where the apple
Was
orchards
it called
are.
Temple Street then?
No, it was the road to Temple.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
called. That's one of the hard parts, is when you're doing your deed work, if you do that, you're going to find that they didn't have street names, and they called it the road leading from so-and-so's house to such and such a place, or so-and-so's house. Do you follow? And so you have to back it out again as you move along.
So when Main Street like goes in, I mean, is that eminent domain and they just took parts, I mean, that would have been the back of our property?
It would have been back to your property. What happened was that was part of a layout of the road from Mason Village, now Greenville, to Wilton, okay? And how do you get to Wilton from here? Initially, you had to go the long way. You had to go out Temple Street to Richardson Road, which then gets you out into the Phil Field area, Kimball Physics and so forth. Take the long way,
Wow.
which is now the dirt road. It
Yeah.
goes up and over and becomes Russell Hill Road in Wilton and comes out where the little red bridge was up beyond Brookside Gas Station, okay? That was the old way to Wilton. Either you did it that way, or you had to go back out Adams Hill Road, out into Mason, and work your way north and get yourself onto the Captain Clark Road to get to Wilton. It was a disaster to do that, and so they were constantly trying to get roads to be laid out. And in classic fashion, just as it is today, you know how the town of New Ipswich won't approve new roads and routinely votes them down at their town meetings. The same was happening then, because it was going to mean more upkeep, and so how do you do it? There were 2 concerns: how do you get to Wilton and how do you get to Milford from here? And the Wilton Road was laid out in the 1840s. There was a method in which, if the selectmen kept denying your request for a layout of a road, you could petition the county commissioners to have the road laid out. And that's what happened. They petitioned to have the road laid out from Gray's Corner in Wilton, where Route 31 meets 101, and put in a road along the river. And the county commissioners said, yes, there's a need for a road, ordered it laid out, and then the town has to pay for it. Okay, that's how the Main Street in Greenville did. And it's an interesting way, it's in a book that now is at the state archives that each county has. It's called the Book of Roads. And we used to have that at the Superior Court. It was downstairs, you blew off the asbestos off the top of it and the dust, and you'd open it up and you'd index it by community. And then you would find these layouts of roads, and they would assess the damages, which meant that you could then tell who the landowners were along the road, okay? And so it would show Chamberlain by and large for a lot of this. The second road out that was a thing, how do you get from Greenville to Milford? What people wanted was a quicker way, and that's caused the layout of Pratt Pond Road in Mason. And they plugged in that one from the back road to Mason down to the Starch Mill Road at the J. Almus Russell place that went right down to where the pond is, and then along. It was the quickest way. When I was a child, at the top of the hill, at the old fork in the road, there was a stone mileage point. And it had an arrow, and it said Milford, and it had the mileage under it. It had a stone rubbing on it. And then when I was in college, the stone got stolen. And it's no longer there, but if you ever see one where it says Milford and has an arrow, if it matches my rubbing, it's stolen property. It belongs back in Mason instead. But it was a road that clearly they didn't want to have to maintain and lay out, and yet it did, and it was ordered laid out.
The original road that went to Wilton, there's some beautiful stone walls on there. Was that like old farm country?
Which road are you talking about?
The one that goes, what's the name of it? It goes through
is it the Richardson Road?
It comes out right above where the gas station is on 38.
Yes.
It's a
Okay.
dirt road
That's
and it's got the
Russell
huge
Hill
stone.
Road and past the stone marker where somebody got struck by lightning and stuff. There were houses along that thing, and you can tell that you can see the stone wall and then the faced granite. And there were houses in various places, and it was just, as people moved out west and agriculture became more difficult here, those farms were allowed to revert.
Huh.
And ultimately the town.
I get a lot of good mushrooms out there. Yeah.
And so it's an old road. That road was the main connecting road from Wilton Center to the center of New Ipswich. And it just happened to neck the northwest corner of Mason, which is now Greenville. And so originally to get from the village here in Greenville to Temple, you didn't take Route 45. That was another petition layout road. And they landed it on the Greenville section, but when you get out to the Greenville Temple town line, as you come up past George Fafford's on the left with the little pond and the red barn, and you go along, there's a house on the right and apple orchards behind it. The road used to bear kind of to the right and down the hill and so forth, and you got onto East Road in Temple and then worked your way up into the center of Temple. It was the old way. And then in 1822, they laid out Route 45 all the way down from Temple Mountain, Revolutionary Road, and so forth. There are sections of it that come all the way to the Massachusetts line as a road to get from Peterborough down into Massachusetts, get to the Turnpike. Gene.
On Turnpike Road, where was the toll collected?
The tolls were collected at various places. According to the town histories, at the bottom of the hill.
Messina Hill?
No, right at the Massachusetts line, because that's where it became the toll road. It was the third New Hampshire Turnpike, and then everybody under there was always trying to avoid tolls. In New Ipswich, it was a big problem, and they ultimately gave up collecting tolls for residents because they just flaunted it by and large. Or what they would do is they would build these roads that ran parallel to the turnpike to avoid the tolls. Okay? And you possibly have it with Pierce Lane / Reed Road is a way. That, if you look at it on a map, that runs parallel to the turnpike. And it may be a method of avoiding the tolls. The turnpike never was a moneymaker, if you will. It certainly opened the area and created traffic that was going from Massachusetts to Vermont, to Keene, and then further on if possible. And so they did, but they did, that was just put it through as straight as possible, and they ended up with huge hills, problems, and so forth. And ultimately, they ended up declaring it a free road and going bankrupt. And some towns ended up keeping it and others didn't. And it's pretty straight, but most of the houses and places along probably made money as places for travelers to stay and spend the night, served as inns and so forth. And there was a major stop right at the Greenville, New Ipswich town line. There was an inn, the Fort Reed Tavern, was on the northeast side of the road, there on the New Ipswich side. And so there were these various places where they would stop, change horses, or whatever they were going to do as they move along forth. And so the turnpike, in large part, doesn't have a huge effect on Mason Village, Greenville, as much as it does to the other towns. It did initially in its early time because it was the quick way and it was where you could get public transportation at the time. You could catch a stage to Boston. But in 1850, with the coming of the railroad, everything shifted and the focus then shifts. You could take, in 1850, you could walk right down the street here, get on the train, and get yourself to Boston and from there to New York and the world. This was civilization.
What happened?
Long story. So, we have other questions about old houses in Greenville or
What about the hotel?
Was Mr. Laomi,
Chamberlain?
Chamberlain the first, the one who built our home?
Yes, he would have been or at least he would have been the one who owned the property and had it built.
Right.
Okay, he Loami Chamberlain was someone who worked on mills and looms. And he had a number of mechanics who worked for him. He comes out of the whole tradition of initially England didn't want the knowledge of looms and so forth to be exported into this country so that they could keep the business there. We would produce the cotton, ship it over and so forth. And they restricted emigration of people coming into this country who had knowledge, but they kept sneaking out and so forth. And so he did that, and he had, in the Mason history, it talks about some of what he did as he developed things. And probably that's what made him wealthy as he went forward. He did that. You find Greenville had various ethnic waves that came through. The early settlement was of the Yankee folk that were descendants of people who came out of England in the Great Puritan migration in the mid-1600s, and they're pushing further and further in. In the 1830s and 40s, here in Mason Village, you have Scottish people coming in, and in large part for the mills. They're recruited and bring them in from outside of Glasgow. And then in the 1850s and 1860s, the Irish arrive with the railroads, and they deal with the mills as well and so forth. And then in the latter part of the 1870s and in the 1880s, then the French Canadian population is recruited to work in the mills and comes in. And that's the last major wave or tsunami of immigrants into Greenville as we move forward. Okay. But it's Loami Chamberlain who does a lot with the mills. There's no question about it. He played not only with cotton, but with wool. They initially did some woolen work in Greenville and then shifted everything to cotton.
So it's his son then that built the mill on Mill
James,
Street?
that's right.
Okay.
The second picture.
Right, yeah, and wasn't he the one also who had the bridge built on Mill Street?
Yes. But he didn't pay for the bridge.
Oh, okay.
He got the town to do that.
A smart man.
I mean, a good deal and
Yeah.
stuff as it opened it up and moved forward.
Were the bricks, I'm sorry, one more question. I heard that the bricks for the mills were made in Greenville?
That's correct.
Fired in Greenville?
Down in back, if you go down Baker Ave to the end,
Oh, Baker Ave.
in that area and across the river was where the brickyard was. And if you look at the larger insert, it will show on brickyard. Do you follow? You can see where the railroad station is, go out the Wilton Road, and on the right it says Brick YD. It was the brickyard. And so they fired bricks as well, okay? And you had that section down there. And the Chamberlains always ran a farm at the same time that they had their business enterprises going. That was how interesting how they backed up against each other here in the village. The Chamberlains had a farm, the Barretts had a farm right beyond the war monuments where Columbian Ave was. There was a barn and their fields and pastures went up the hill. Farms did well in Mason Village and in the immediate vicinity because you had a population, so you had a market for your goods. And so they could do that. People from Marion Hill and Adamsville peddled milk and butter here in the village. And if they didn't do that, they could just put it on the train and ship it to Boston. My great-great-grandfather did that. You know, have it on the 7 o'clock train, and on the evening train in, they got their payment and stuff, and they shipped down to the Quincy market every day and stuff. And there were all these things that we were told, you know, the milk products belonged to the men. The women got the eggs, and that was pin money. That's what I remember hearing that. They could buy pins and stuff, jewelry.
So what kind of farm did the Chamberlains own?
Their farm, well, of course, they had the barn right here on
Right.
Main Street and stuff, but everything was down where the sewage treatment plant is now, was part of that. Also, Dunster Hill, the top of it was all pasture, and then they let it go back to
So
forest.
when Main Street went in, obviously Columbian Mill owned all of that property. They would have then sold it to Chamberlain?
No, Chamberlain owned independent of the Columbian. And
Okay.
so they sold back and forth.
Okay.
You know, it wasn't like today. They didn't have to get subdivision approval, so whatever worked, worked. And the deal went through as long as the money was good. And so each entity was, or family was doing whatever they were doing. And so you find some interrelationship going on.
And when did they reconstruct the town hall? When it used to be a wooden building, correct?
No,
Wasn't
it was
wooden
never a
building?
wooden building.
Didn't it
Town
burn
Hall
though?
was built in 1876 as a brick building, and then in 1936, I believe, it burned.
Right, it caught fire.
Yeah, and what they did was they rebuilt, and they changed the front and they changed the style
Right.
from clearly a Gothic type building into what it is today. If you look at the earlier pictures of the town hall versus today, you will find that all of the doors on this side and the windows
I
are the
got a
same
post
as
office.
what was
I
there
got a post
before.
office.
And so they work within
Yeah, I
the
got a
structure.
post office, that's why I knew the term. I got a post office.
When was the cistern on top of Dunster Hill used?
There were two of those. There was one on High Street and one on Dunster Hill. And I can't tell you without looking at my notes. One was for the fire system, for the hydrant system, and one was for the water system. Okay? And I suspect that the one up on Dunster Hill may have been the fire system, but I'm not positive. I think that that's what that was. There's the little reservoir up there that has a fence around it and so forth.
Right. Did they have a movie theater up on Main Street, a
Pardon
movie
me?
theater? A movie theater,
Movie theater was right upstairs.
right, upstairs on
In
Main
the
Street.
town,
No,
no, in the
was
town
it-
hall
Town
here.
hall? I knew they had one
Upstairs
here
is the
somewhere.
projection room
Almost
where
forget
the,
about what you're.
where the Historical Society, and with the movies, you mentioned the name Charles Sawyer,
Sawyer, right.
Chili, and he ran the movies.
Right,
And so-
I remember the name.
and Rosalma played for them.
I heard those
In the
names.
building above
Chow-
the post
Above the post office, up there was where the phone company was for years. It
Upstairs,
was upstairs above the post office in that area.
big space.
And then there were three different inns. You had the one, what I would call the Bernier Place, right across from the post office. And that was two full stories and had a barn attached to it, a livery stable, so that you get off at the train, go there and rent your horse and go wherever you're going, and so forth. They lowered that house in the 1960s to one full story as opposed to two. There was the boarding house for the mill, the Red Brick Inn, and then on the other part of Main Street, if you come down Temple Street, there's the big house that was an inn as well. It's 2 stories, has a double porch on it. And it gets to the right of the parking lot that goes with Lazat's. That was an inn as well. Other questions? Charlie?
Well, I just, not, this is a plug. If you're interested in some of the history, we have some of this on our website, www.chamberlainlibrary.org. If you like the Hill book, I've got about half of it scanned in and put into a document file. You can get that. If you don't have internet access, we'll burn you a CD, or you can just come here and see it. And also, if you're interested in the Columbia Mills, we just received we have the original ledgers, and we received a grant from the state to have these preserved and digitized, and we just got the 4 of the ledgers back from the digitization process. So if you want to see ledgers and a lot of really interesting information, that's going to be up on the website soon, and if you want a DVD of that stuff, it's in PDF format. You're welcome to come in and we'll burn you a CD. So lots of good stuff on there, plus all the town reports are on there.
Okay, I need the 2 town histories back.
Here's one.
1
Here
and
it is.
2. You can keep the libraries. Mine's the beat up one. When you use them a lot, the bindings run out on you. What I thought we could do is, unless you have other questions, if you want to come forward, I can pull out pictures from your street, and you can look at what we have. There may or may not be pictures of your house. I look at some of you, and I know we don't have what you're looking for, but we do have some pictures in our collection, and I'm certainly willing to try to answer questions for you on some of your pieces of property.
Marshall, what's High Street?
High Street is an old road. That's the main road from Mason Village to New Ipswich. So that dates into probably the 1760s when they built the first of the mills here, because then people would be coming to get grain ground or lumber mill. And so High Street is older than River Street. Well, thank you very much for coming out and listening to my chatter and stuff. And so we'll see you at the next round, whatever that will be, and keep working on it.